I never thought a single night could change the course of so many lives until the fire. It began with flames tearing through a house and a young woman, Celine, throwing herself into the smoke to save a child who wasn't even her own. That moment, raw and desperate, pulled her into a world of secrets, betrayals, and a family torn apart by grief and lies. But was her courage enough to heal what years of silence had broken? Or would it make her the perfect target for those who wanted the Vayner legacy destroyed? Before we dive in, let us know, what time are you listening to this? And where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The first light of morning spread across the valley, mist curling low over the rows of vines that stretched as far as Celine Ward could see. From the long glass hallway of the Vayner estate, she paused a moment, pressing her palm lightly against the cool pane. The vineyard looked peaceful, golden light breaking through patches of fog. But inside the great house, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Celine was 25, young enough to still be hopeful, yet old enough to carry the weight of too many goodbyes. She had grown up in foster homes, always shifting, never staying long enough for a place to become her own. The job at the Vayner estate had been a chance, perhaps her last chance, to build something steady. What she wanted most wasn't money or status. It was belonging. Somewhere she wouldn't have to pack her bags and move on again. The mansion itself was grand but hushed, like a museum where no one dared speak too loudly. Adrian Vayner, the widowed owner, carried himself with the clipped formality of a man used to being obeyed. His little girl, Alara, still so small at 6, was quiet in ways that seemed too heavy for a child. Celine had been asked to help look after her, a task she accepted with equal parts gratitude and nervousness. It didn't take long for her to notice the eyes that followed her down corridors or across the kitchen. The older staff whispered to one another when she passed, "Their looks cool," measuring. To them, she wasn't one of them, not part of this house's long rhythm. She was a newcomer, replaceable, someone who might not last through the season. Even Adrian, polite but distant, treated her more like a temporary solution than a person worth knowing. Alara was different. The girl clung to memories of her late mother, speaking of her in fragments, as though afraid the words might vanish if she said too much. Celine recognized the longing. She, too, knew what it felt like to ache for someone who wasn't there. When Alara placed her small hand in hers, it stirred something old inside Celine, an echo of a life she'd once wished for. That evening, after the day's work was done, Celine stayed behind in the kitchen, quietly rinsing dishes while the others retired. The air smelled faintly with smoke and lemon oil polish. From the parlor came the soft, halting sound of a piano. Alara's thin fingers pressed the keys one after another, the notes tumbling into the empty house like questions with no answers. Celine stopped scrubbing, leaning against the counter. Her chest tightened with an old, familiar dread. She whispered to herself, barely moving her lips, Maybe they'll send me away, just like all the times before." Evenings at the Vayner estate usually carried a calm rhythm. The sun dropping behind the hills, cicadas starting up in the vineyard rows, the faint clink of glasses as Adrian entertained guests on the wide back terrace. That night was no different, at least until it was. Adrian stood under the glow of string lights, talking business with a pair of investors, his voice clipped but measured. Inside, the staff moved about cleaning dishes and resetting tables, trying to stay invisible. Celine was tidying the kitchen, grateful for the quiet after a long day, when the sharp crack of something falling made her pause. At first it seemed harmless. A pot shifting, maybe, but then came the smell. Acrid, oily smoke sliding under the door like a warning. She dropped the rag in her hand and rushed toward the stove. Flames licked up from the bottom of the cabinets, greedy and fast, climbing toward the ceiling as if the old wood itself had been waiting to ignite. The alarm shrieked. Within seconds, a hallway outside was thick with black haze. The staff shouted over one another, feet pounding the floorboards. Someone yelled, "Get out," and another screamed, "This way." The house that had felt cold and formal just hours before now roared with chaos. Celine's first thought was of Alara. The girl's bedroom was upstairs, down a narrow hall lined with oak beams. Celine coughed hard as she pushed against the current of bodies streaming toward the exit. "Where's Alara?" she cried, but no one answered. Panic made her chest burn more fiercely than the smoke did. She yanked a heavy quill from a chair by the stairs and wrapped around her shoulders, pulling it up over her nose. Step by step she forced herself upward, each stair groaning under her weight as fire snapped at the banister. Heat pressing from all sides, the hallway a tunnel of flame and suffocating smoke. She kept one arm against the wall, her other hand dragging the quilt forward as a shield. "Celine!" Illyria's voice was faint, but sharp enough to cut through the alarm's shrill cry. The sound came from the far end of the hall. Celine ran, her eyes stinging, until she reached the child's door. She shoved it open and found Illyria curled against the bed frame, eyes wide and streaming. "Come here, sweetheart," Celine gasped, scooping the girl into her arms. She pulled the quilt around both of them, tucking Illyria's face against her shoulder. The air was thick, biting at her lungs. The way back seemed longer than before, each second stretched thin. Halfway down the stairs, a beam split with a crack and crashed beside them, scattering embers. Celine stumbled but didn't stop. She barreled through the smoke, the quilt smoldering at the edges, her mind fixed on the single thought of reaching the outside door. At last the cool night air rushed over her. She staggered onto the stone steps, clutching Illyria, and then her knees gave out. The world tilted and dimmed. The last thing she felt was a child's tiny arms still clinging to her. When she came to, she was lying on grass, chest aching, throat raw from smoke. The sounds of chaos lingered. Sirens in the distance, shouts from neighbors gathering at the gates. Illyria was safe, wrapped in another blanket. A medic crouched beside her. For a heartbeat, relief warmed Celine's chest. She had done it, but then Adrian's shadow loomed over her. His face was pale with anger rather than gratitude. "If you kept an eye on the kitchen," he snapped, his voice cutting across the night, "this never would have happened. Do you realize she almost died?" Celine stared up at him, stunned, words trapped in her throat. Behind him, two of the senior staff muttered to each other. One shook his head, whispering, "Wasn't her shift in the kitchen?" The other answered, "Wouldn't be surprised it started because she wasn't careful." The sting of their suspicion was sharper than the burns on her hands. Celine pressed her lips together, tasting ash, and felt the old fear coil inside her, the certainty that no matter what she did, she would always be the one to blame. By the next morning, the fire trucks were gone, but the smell of smoke lingered in every hallway. Local news crews set up at the gates. Cameras pointed toward the scorched walls of the estate. Headlines hit the internet before dawn. One photo in particular spread quickly. Celine carrying Illyria down the steps, the child's face buried in her shoulder, flames raging behind them. Yet the caption beneath the image didn't call her a hero. It asked a question: accident at Vayner Estate, or something darker within? The smoke smell never really left the house. Even after the fire, crews packed up and the windows were thrown wide open. A faint sting clung to the walls and the curtains. Celine carried that scent with her, as though it had woven itself into her clothes. Every time she caught a whiff of it, the guilt in her chest tightened. She had saved Illyria, yes, but she couldn't shake the thought that maybe she should have prevented the blaze in the first place. In the days that followed, she caught herself packing in her mind where she'd put her shoes, how she might fold her dresses if she had to leave on short notice. She had lived this pattern too many times. Arrive, try, fail, then move on before the blame stuck. But just as she thought about retreating, Illyria made it impossible. The little girl began trailing her everywhere. At mealtime, she'd reach for Celine's hand, ignoring the staff who had looked after her since birth. At night, she refused to sleep unless Celine tucked her in. One morning, when Celine tried to step out of the room, Illyria clutched her wrist with surprising strength. "Don't go," she whispered. "Everybody else goes away." Those words cut deep. Celine saw herself in the child's eyes, the same desperate grip she'd once used to hold on to anyone willing to stay. It tore at her resolve. She wanted to walk away before the weight of suspicion crushed her, but how could she abandon a girl who needed her like that? Adrian noticed. He stood often in doorways, arms crossed, watching Celine and his daughter. His expression was unreadable. When Illyria buried her face against Celine's side, his jaw tightened. He wanted his child safe, but he couldn't ignore the gnawing doubt that the woman she clung to might have had a hand, however indirect, in the disaster. His silence grew heavier by the day. It was during this uneasy lull that Marcus Hale reappeared. Once the estate's manager, he'd left under cloudy circumstances. Now he strolled back into town as though nothing had happened, shaking hands, buying rounds at the bar. He appeared at Café Marlowe, the only place where gossip moved faster than the coffee. "Place isn't what it used to be," he remarked to anyone who would listen, his tone casual but sharp enough to cut. Vayner Estate used to run tight. Not anymore. Fires don't just start themselves. Word traveled quick. Some patrons nodded, agreeing that the proud house was slipping. Others muttered about gratitude. Celine had pulled Alaire out of the flames, after all. But the murmurs carried a split tone, half praise, half suspicion. At one table, a worker from the vineyard said, "She's brave, no doubt." From another corner, a voice countered, "Or maybe she knew just where to be when the fire started." The whispers pressed down on Celine every time she walked through town. People stared a little too long, their conversations pausing when she passed. She tried to keep her head low, but the tension gnawed at her, fed by the way Adrian barely spoke to her beyond what was necessary. One evening, unable to sleep, Celine wandered into the older section of the estate. The house was quiet, the staff long since retired. She carried a small lantern as she stepped into the storage wing, dust hanging in the air like fine powder. Something felt off. Near the heavy wooden door of the wine storage, she noticed splintered wood around the lock. She crouched, running her fingers along the jagged edge. It looked like someone had forced their way in. Her stomach tightened. Inside, shelves stood orderly except for a section where paper should have been stacked. An entire folder was missing, leaving a clean gap among the dust lines. Celine's pulse quickened. She whispered to herself, this wasn't just an accident. The fire, the whispers, the missing records, it all pointed to something larger. She extinguished the lantern and pressed her back against the cold stone wall, listening to the stillness. Somewhere beyond the quiet, she thought she heard the faint creak of a door closing. Whoever had been here might still be nearby. The fire had barely cooled when the paper started circling. By the end of the week, headlines screamed that Vayner Estate had slipped into negligence, that its once proud name was crumbling. One article hinted at systemic mismanagement. Another tied the blaze to declining vineyard production. Stockholders reacted fast. Shares of the winery dropped, wiping out months of steady gains. For Adrian, who had built the company with precision and control, the public blow was a knife twisting in his side. The pressure didn't stop at the newsstands. The board of directors called an emergency session, their tone more hostile than concerned. Over speakerphone, voices pressed into Adrian's study. "We can't afford another scandal. The market has no patience for instability." One even pushed openly, "Perhaps it's time you considered stepping down, at least temporarily." Adrian stood by the window after the call ended, staring at the vineyard rows stretching into fog. His jaw clenched, his fingers drumming against the sill. He hated the feeling, cornered, second-guessed. And in the back of his mind, the image of Celine crouched in the smoky hallways replayed, tangled with suspicion. That evening, he sought her out in the kitchen. She was wiping down the counter, her hair pulled back, sleeves rolled. She looked up, startled by the sharpness in his step. "What exactly did you see in that storage room?" Adrian's tone was colder than the tile beneath their feet. "You've been whispering about missing files. Are you trying to invent proof that keeps the blame off you?" Celine froze, cloth hanging limp in her hand. For a moment she considered swallowing the sting, the way she always had when accused. But Alaire's face flashed in her mind, wide eyes in the smoke, a hand clutching hers. Her voice shook but didn't break. "If I cared only about myself," she said, "I'd have left Alaire in that burning room. But I didn't, did I? I carried her out when everyone else ran." The words hung heavy. Adrian's mouth tightened, but he didn't reply. His silence was louder than any outburst. He turned abruptly and left, the echo of his footsteps trailing long after the door shut. Celine's chest ached. Part of her wanted to crumple against the counter, to let the tears fall. But another part of her, the one forged in years of being doubted, rose up steadier than before. She wasn't going to shrink, not this time. While the house strained under the weight of suspicion, Marcus Hale was busy in town. He spoke casually to a reporter outside Café Marlowe, his words laced with false sympathy. "It's a shame. What's happening to the Vayners?" he said, lowering his voice just enough for effect. "But between you and me, there's someone inside that place making sure it doesn't recover." The quote found its way into the Sunday edition. For readers who wanted a villain, the idea of betrayal from within was too enticing to ignore. Adrian read it over breakfast, coffee growing cold at his elbow. His mind circled back to Celine again. Late that night, Celine returned to her small room off the east wing. The hallway was quiet, lamps flickering low. She had just shut the door when something slid against the floor. She bent down, heart thudding, and picked up an envelope with no name. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the letters jagged as if written in haste. The message was blunt. The fire was only the beginning. If you want peace, leave this house. Her hands trembled as she read it again. Someone knew exactly who she was, and they wanted her gone. She sat on the edge of the bed, the note crumpling in her fist. Fear pressed in, but alongside it came something sharper. Resolve. She whispered into the stillness, "I'm not running this time." The boardroom at Vayner State's corporate office was never a warm place, but that morning it felt downright hostile. Adrian sat at the head of the long oak table, jaw tight, his shoulders squared like a man bracing against a storm. Around him, the directors flipped through folders, their voices cutting into him one by one. "This isn't sustainable, Adrian," one said, adjusting his glasses. "Shareholders are demanding answers," another added, tapping a pen against the table. They weren't merely asking questions. They were circling. The fire, the stock drop, the bad press. It had all piled into a single accusation. Adrian had lost control. And then came Damian Cross. He hadn't been invited in an official sense, but somehow he slipped into a room with that calm authority only a seasoned manipulator could wear. Once a respected member of the board. Now he stood there as an outside advisor, hands folded neatly in front of him, voice smooth as honey. "Gentlemen," Damian began, "it may be time to consider a temporary change in leadership, just until the dust settles. Stability is what the market craves." Adrian's eyes narrowed. He didn't answer right away, but the tension in his neck gave him away. For a man who had spent years building a reputation control, this suggestion was poison. In the hallway outside, Celine had paused mid-step, carrying a folder of routine documents. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but Damian's words froze her in place. And then, faintly, she heard another voice down the corridor. Marcus Hale. The two men spoke in half-sentences, the way conspirators do when they assume no one is listening. Marcus's tone was smug, Damian's measured, but together the meaning was clear. The fire had only been one piece of a larger plan, and Adrian's downfall was their opportunity. Celine pressed her back against the wall. The folder clutched to her chest. Her pulse quickened. She knew she couldn't keep this to herself. That evening she found Adrian in his study, the fire in the hearth casting shadows across his face. "I overheard them," she said quickly, her words tumbling out. "Damian and Marcus, they're working together. They want you out." Adrian turned slowly, his expression hard to read. "You've been listening at doors now." His voice carried an edge. "Maybe you heard what you wanted to hear. Or maybe you're trying to deflect from your own mistakes." Her throat tightened. "I wouldn't make this up. You think I don't know what it feels like to be blamed for things I didn't do." But Adrian's eyes were flat, his disbelief sharper than any insult. The rejection cut through her like glass. Inside, the old wound reopened. She had always been the one no one trusted, no matter how hard she tried. Days later, the storm broke wider. A batch of internal emails spilled across news outlets, painting Adrian as a man siphoning funds and hiding debts. The reports spread like wildfire, faster than he could deny them. Protesters began to gather outside the estate gates with handmade signs. Justice for workers, truth for Calora. The air outside the once proud vineyards carried not the scent of ripe grapes, but the bitterness of betrayal. Celine stood at the upstairs window, watching the crowd one afternoon, her stomach heavy. She thought of the folder that had gone missing in the storeroom, the broken lock. Pieces were falling into place, but Adrian still looked at her as if she might be part of the scheme. The hurt deepened when she went to pick Alara up from school. She had expected the child's shy smile, the usual rush into her arms. Instead, she found Alara sitting alone on the edge of the playground, her eyes downcast. A group of children stood nearby, their voices carrying. "Her dad's a crook," one boy sneered. "She's a liar's kid." Alara's face crumpled, but she didn't argue. She just pulled her knees up and tried to disappear into herself. Celine's chest burned. She crouched down, opening her arms. Alara rushed into her embrace, trembling. Celine held her tight, ignoring the stares from the other children and the parents whispering on the sidelines. "I've got you," she whispered into the child's hair. "No matter what they say, I've got you." The night air in Kilora was sharp enough to sting her lungs. Celine wrapped her cardigan tighter as she left the small brick library that sat on the edge of town. It was nearly closing time when she finished reshelving a stack of children's books, something she volunteered for now and then, mostly to remind herself of quieter places, safer rhythms. The street was empty except for a flickering lamppost and the hum of crickets in the vines beyond. She started down the gravel path toward the estate, shoes crunching softly. At first she thought the echo of footsteps belonged to her own, but then, after she paused, the sound lingered a half-beat longer. She turned, scanning the shadows. A figure slipped between the trees, too quick to make out clearly. Her heart shot into her throat. She quickened her pace, gravel scattering beneath her steps. The vines rose high on either side of the dirt road, creating dark tunnels that muffled the sound of her breath. The footsteps behind her grew faster. She broke into a run, panic rising as her mind flashed back to fire and smoke, to Alara's hand in hers. A rough voice carried across the night, low and threatening. "You should have left when you had the chance." She stumbled, nearly falling. In the distance, headlights cut across the rows. A car door slammed. Adrian's voice boomed through the night, sharp as steel. "Enough!" The shadow retreated into vines, disappearing as quickly as it had come. Celine collapsed against a fence post, chest heaving. Adrian reached her, eyes blazing, not with relief, but anger. "You see what you've done," he shouted. "You've brought danger straight to this family. They're not after you alone. They're after all of us." Tears welled before she could stop them. "They're after you," she cried, her voice breaking. "I'm just caught in the middle. But if you can't trust me, then I'll prove it myself." Adrian stood stiff, his jaw set. He only turned back toward the car, leaving Celine trembling in the dark, her promise echoing in her own ears. From that night on, something shifted inside her. She stopped waiting for Adrian's approval and began piecing together the threads herself. The missing files, the broken lock, Marcus's smirk in town, all of it pulled her deeper. She returned to the storage buildings alone, searching corners she hadn't before. In the back of the old wine warehouse, beneath a stack of ledgers coated with dust, she found them. Photocopies of transfers, initials scrawled in Marcus Hale's hand. The numbers were damning. Money siphoned into an account that had no business existing. Her hands trembled as she tucked the folder under her arm. This was it. Proof. Something she could put in front of Adrian to force him to see the truth. She hurried back through the corridor toward the main house. But halfway down, the lantern flickered, shadows shifting. A gust of air blew through, the kind that meant a door had just opened or closed nearby. She clutched the file tighter and kept moving. By the time she reached the study, her heart was hammering. "I found it," she said breathlessly, stepping inside. "Marcus has been draining the funds. Look." But when she opened her arms, the folder was gone, empty. Her hands shook, her arms bare. She spun in confusion. It had been there a moment ago. Adrian rose slowly from behind his desk, his face hard. "Do you think this is a game?" His voice was low, but cut deeper than a shout. "Documents vanish only when you touch them. Every time you claim you found proof, it disappears." Celine's mouth went dry. "No," she whispered, her voice fierce. "I held it. I saw the numbers. Someone took it from me, His eyes narrowed. I don't know if I can believe you anymore. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She stepped closer, meeting his gaze without flinching, fire in her eyes. You don't have to believe me now, but the day will come when the truth stares you in the face. And when it does, I hope it's not too late. The small brown package looked out of place against the iron gate. No stamps, no courier tag, just her name written across the top in uneven black strokes. Celine. For a long minute she stood staring at it, heart thudding. Out here, nothing ever arrived with her name. She almost left it there, thinking it was safer not to touch, but in the end her fingers reached through the bars and lifted it. The cardboard was light, barely weighing more than an apple. Inside her room she shut the door, setting the box on her desk like it might bite. She slit the tape with a butter knife, the cardboard giving way with a dry rip. Out slid a flash drive. No note, no explanation. Celine sat on the edge of the bed, staring at it in her palm. Her first thought was to toss it in the trash and pretend she'd never seen it. But some quiet voice inside whispered she needed to know. She slid it into her old laptop. At once a file opened to sound scratchy at first, then sharpening into voices she recognized. Marcus Hale's gravelly tone filled the room. The old man won't hold out much longer. The market already smells blood. Her breath caught. Then Damien Cross's voice followed, smooth, deliberate, like a man laying chess pieces. Once the board loses its confidence, Adrian will have no choice but to step aside. Your job is to keep the fires burning, Marcus. Keep the chaos alive. Celine clapped a hand over her mouth. So it was true. Every suspicion she had carried alone, all of it spelled out clear as day. The fire, the press leaks, the mounting pressure, it was all orchestrated. Then the recording shifted. Damien's tone dropped lower, measured, almost intimate. And don't forget, we have help from inside. Someone under that roof has been feeding us since day one. The audio cut to silence. Celine sat frozen, her pulse hammering. Inside, someone here. Her eyes darted to the closed door of her room, to the faint murmur of voices downstairs. She thought of the cook, the housekeeper, even the driver who rarely spoke. Any of them could be the traitor. Or worse, someone even closer to Adrian. She wanted to run straight to him, show him the proof. But she already knew how that would go. Adrian would glare, remind her of the missing files, the fire, the vanished evidence. He'd accuse her of making things up, of being desperate to save herself. The sting of his last words still lingered. I don't know if I can believe you anymore. Her throat tightened. She closed the laptop and pressed her palms to her eyes. If she stayed silent, the danger would grow. If she spoke, she risked losing what little trust remained. Either way, she was caught in the middle. Late that afternoon, Alara pushed open Celine's door without knocking. The girl's small arms carried a stuffed bear worn thin at the seams. She climbed onto Celine's bed and leaned against her. Don't go, she murmured, voice muffled against Celine's arm. Celine smoothed the girl's hair, feeling the soft weight of her. I'm not going anywhere right now, honey. Alara looked up, eyes shining with a child's raw fear. But you will. Everyone leaves. Mama left, then the last nanny. Don't leave me, too. Celine's chest ached. She had known loneliness all her life, abandoned in foster homes, drifting from one place to another, but hearing it in Alara's voice was different. She saw herself in the child's pleading eyes, the same hollow space of being left behind. I won't, Celine whispered, her voice trembling. Not while you need me. The promise sealed something inside her. She could have packed a bag, slipped out under cover of night, started fresh somewhere far from Kilora, but she couldn't, not when Alara's small hand clung so fiercely to hers. That night the estate felt too quiet. Celine checked Alara's windows twice before tucking her in, locking the door softly from the inside. She lingered, watching the girl's chest rise and fall in sleep. Outside, the vineyard stretched black under moon, the wind sliding to the rows with a lonely hiss. She tried to convince herself the creaks of the old house were normal, nothing to fear. But when she stepped into the hallway with a lantern in hand, her blood chilled. At the far end, a shadow moved. Tall, deliberate, not a trick of light. The figure glided past the staircase, pausing as if sensing her there. For a suspended moment, Celine thought the person might turn, but instead they slipped into the darkness, vanishing deeper into the corridor. Her grip tightened on the lantern's handle. Every instinct screamed for her to retreat, to bolt the door and hide. But another voice, quieter, stronger, rose inside. If she ran, she'd be no better than the ghost of her past. The first thing Celine noticed was the draft. The cellar door usually sealed tight, the kind of heavy oak that groaned when pushed, yet tonight it hung ajar. The hallway smelled faintly of smoke and wax. She hesitated, lantern in hand, then nudged the door wider. The old steps groaned under her weight as she descended. The cellar was cool, damp with the scent of oak barrels and dust. But what froze her in place was the flicker of light. In the center of the room sat a stub of candle, melted wax pooled beneath it, flame wobbling as though someone had just blown across it. No note, no movement, just that candle, burning low like a silent threat. Celine's pulse raced. Whoever left it wanted her to know they'd been there, close enough to reach her if they wanted. She bent and pinched the wick out, plunging the room into darkness. For a long breath she stood still, listening. Nothing but the faint hum of the refrigerator upstairs. She slipped out quickly, pushing the cellar door shut behind her. She thought about going to Adrian, but the memory of his eyes, sharp and suspicious, stopped her cold. He'd accuse her again, call it another fabrication. And maybe, just maybe, he'd be right. Back in her room, she sat on the edge of the bed, burying her face in her hands. "Am I losing my mind?" she whispered into quiet. "Is this really happening, or am I dragging danger here with me?" Doubt gnawed at her, deeper than she wanted to admit. She had wandered from place to place so often in her life that trouble felt like a shadow, one she couldn't shake. Maybe this was her curse, never finding peace, always the outsider who stirred chaos. Her door creaked open. Ilara padded in barefoot, clutching her bare to her chest. The girl crawled onto the bed, eyes wide, voice small. "Don't leave," she whispered. "If you go, it'll be like when Mama left. I'll lose her all over again." Celine froze. The words slid past her defenses like a blade. She had spent years telling herself she didn't need anyone, that being left behind no longer hurt. But hearing it from Ilara's lips, raw, desperate, pulled the air from her lungs. She drew the girl close, holding her tight. "I'm not leaving," Celine murmured, stroking her hair. "Not while you need me." The promise rooted itself, quiet but unshakable. Running wasn't an option anymore. She'd stay, no matter the cost. The next morning, Celine slipped into town, keeping her hood low against the buzz of gossip that still clung to her name. At the corner of Main and Willow stood a modest brick building. Arden and Lowe's, attorneys at law. She had seen their sign while running errand before, but never thought she'd walk through the glass door. Inside, a young lawyer named Jordan Reeves offered a handshake. His sleeves rolled at the elbows, eyes curious but kind. "You said it was about some financial records?" Celine laid out the photocopies she had managed to salvage from the estate's archives. Numbers, transfers, signatures. Jordan scanned them, tapping a pencil against the desk. "This isn't just sloppy bookkeeping," he said after a moment. Marcus Hale moved company funds into a shell account, then drafted documents that made it look like Adrian Vayner had authorized a massive loan. On paper, it makes the estate look like it's drowning in debt. Celine felt her stomach knot. So Marcus set him up. Jordan nodded. "If these are real, yes. But you'll need more than copies to convince a board, or Adrian himself. Originals, witnesses, something harder to deny." Her throat tightened. Originals, always just out of reach. That evening she returned to the estate, the weight of the folder heavy in her hands. She rehearsed what she would say, how she would stand steady, not let Adrian's doubt crush her again. In his study, Adrian sat behind the wide mahogany desk, the lamplight carving lines into his face. He looked up as she entered, his gaze cool, unreadable. "I found something," Celine began, setting the papers down. "Proof that Marcus staged the debt, that he's been—" Adrian's hand came down flat on the desk, silencing her. His eyes locked on the top page, not with recognition, but with something darker. He lifted it slowly, then turned it for her to see. Her own name stared back at her, her signature scrawled across a transfer order, authorizing the very move she meant to expose. Celine's breath hitched. "That's not, I didn't." Adrian's voice was ice. "Celine, this is your handwriting. These papers don't just implicate Marcus. They implicate you." Her knees went weak, the room tilting. She stepped back as though struck. "I swear to you, I never signed that. Someone forged it. They must have." "Enough?" Adrian snapped, his fist curling. "Every time you claim innocence, more evidence surfaces against you. Tell me the truth. Did you betray this house?" Tears pricked her eyes, but anger rose sharper. "If all I wanted was to save myself, I would have left weeks ago. I stay for Alara, for this family that refuses to see me as anything but the enemy." Adrian's stare didn't waver. The silence between them stretched heavy, suffocating. Celine's chest heaved as she met his eyes. "If you can't see the truth now, you will. And when you do, I just hope it isn't too late." Celine stood frozen, staring at the papers that condemned her. Her own name curved across the bottom line of a transfer order she knew she had never signed. The room tilted. The air felt thick, and she could barely hear the words leaving Adrian's mouth. "You took what little trust one had left in you," he said, his tone cold, measured. "Every syllable like a nail driven in. And you used it against me." She wanted to scream, to throw the papers back at him, but her throat closed. Instead, her mind dragged her back years, to the echo of social workers shaking their heads, to the whispers of foster parents who called her a liar when she insisted she hadn't broken their rules. That girl's trouble. You can see it in her eyes. She had lived her whole life with those labels. And now, in this grand estate she had started to believe could be different, she was right back where she began, misunderstood, accused, unwanted. "Adrian," her voice cracked, almost pleading, "you have to believe me. This isn't my hand. I didn't write this." His expression didn't soften. "The world doesn't care for excuses, Celine. Not in this house. Not in business. Not anywhere." Her chest ached with a hollow kind of pain. He wasn't just doubting her. He was cutting her out, shoving her into the same shadow she'd been running from her entire life. The news spread faster than she could breathe. By morning, headlines blared across town. Vayner Estate entangled in financial scandal. Internal collapse suspected. Local stations played the same sound bites, and images of the estate's gates flashed on every screen. By noon, angry voices gathered outside, carrying posters that read fraud in the vineyards and "Step Down, Vayner." Patrol cars lined the drive, lights spinning lazily, keeping the crowd from spilling onto property. Celine watched from an upstairs window, heart heavy. She saw Alara's school bus stop at the gate, only to turn away. Minutes later, the school called. For Alara's safety, she would be held until a guardian could ensure the estate was secure. The girl's tearful voice came over the phone, high-pitched and broken. "Celine, please come get me. They won't let me go. Everyone's looking at me funny. They said I can't go home." "I'll fix this," Celine whispered, clutching the receiver. "I promise, sweetheart, I'll make it right." But when the line clicked dead, she felt her knees weaken. She pressed her back to the wall, swallowing a sob. The world wasn't just punishing her. It was punishing Alara, too. By evening, Celine made a decision. If she waited for Adrian's faith, she would wither. If she waited for the world's mercy, she would die waiting. She had to fight for herself, for Alara, with whatever scraps of courage remained. She returned to the office of Ardent and Lowe's, the weight of desperation hanging over her. Jordan Reeves looked surprised to see her again so soon, but he ushered her in. "I need to know if these signatures, my supposed signatures, can be proven false," Celine said, dropping the folder onto his desk. He pulled his glasses down, scanning the documents with a furrowed brow. "We keep digital records of these filings. If someone tampered with them, there should be traces." He turned his computer, fingers flying over the keyboard. Celine sat on the edge of her chair, nails digging into her palms. The seconds stretched like hours. At last, Jordan leaned back, face grim. Someone altered the files, he said. There's metadata showing that your electronic signature was cloned and inserted. This wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. Celine's breath caught. So I'm not crazy. Someone's trying to frame me. Jordan hesitated before adding, but here's the problem. Whoever did this had access to Vayner's internal system. That's not something an outsider could pull off easily. Her heart slammed against her ribs. You mean someone inside the estate? He nodded slowly. Yes. To manipulate these files, the person would need both clearance and knowledge of the estate's private records. Celine felt the blood drain from her face. She had suspected shadows at the edges, whispers from beyond the walls. But this truth cut deeper. The enemy wasn't just outside pressing on the gates. They were walking the same halls. She was sharing the same air, watching her. The thought made her skin crawl. Who? She whispered, half to herself. The staff? The board? Someone who smiles at us every morning. Jordan's eyes softened, but his words remained heavy. I can't answer that yet. But you need to understand, if this is true, then the danger is closer than you think. Celine pushed back her chair, standing on unsteady legs. Her resolve hardened through the fear. She couldn't let Adrian's disbelief crush her. She couldn't let the whispers outside the gate scare her away. She had to stay for Alara and for herself. As she left the law office, the night air pressed cool against her face, but she barely felt it. One thought repeated, circling endlessly in her mind. The traitor is inside these walls. The boardroom smelled of polished wood and old money, yet was filled with nothing but tension. Adrian sat at the head of the long table, his shoulders sagging as the directors pressed harder. Their voices overlapped like a storm. Adrian, the shareholders are furious. One man snapped. This scandal has cut our profits in half. You've lost the public's trust, another added. It's time you step aside for the sake of the company. Each demand struck like a blow. His name, the name that once commanded respect, was now dragging the family into disgrace. He rubbed his temples, wishing the ground would open and swallow him whole. Then Damien Cross leaned forward with a calm smile that chilled the room. If stability is what we all want, Damien said smoothly, I can step in as temporary advisor. With Adrian's agreement, I'll handle operations until this storm passes. That way, the estate doesn't crumble under the weight of public outrage. Adrian lifted his eyes, red-rimmed with exhaustion. He had fought his whole life to preserve what his ancestors had built. Yet here was a man dressed in elegance offering to steal it with velvet words. His hands trembled under the table. The possibility of surrender tasted bitter, but it was real. Meanwhile, Celine was packing her few belongings upstairs at the estate. Every corner of her room carried whispers of suspicion and pain. Adrian's mistrust had carved deeper wounds than the mob at the gate ever could. She folded her clothes with mechanical movements, telling herself that leaving was survival. Still, her heart ached at the thought of Alara, who had clung to her like a lifeline. But as she stepped into the hallway, bag in hand, a hushed voice stopped her. She pressed against the wall, her ears straining. It's working, Marcus Hale murmured. She peeked around the corner, and her breath caught. Standing with him was Mrs. Clarice, the housekeeper who had practically raised generations of Vayners. Her hair pulled into its familiar bun, her posture straight as ever. Yet her words sliced through Celine's world. Adrian never questions me, Clarice whispered. He trusts me more than anyone. That's why the files had to go through my hands. That's why she, her voice dripped with disdain, was the perfect scapegoat. Marcus chuckled darkly. And now Damien has the leverage he wanted. Once Adrian steps aside, we'll have full access. You've done well, Clarice. Celine's pulse thundered in her ears. The betrayal was staggering. Clarice, the woman who polished the silver, set Alara's bedtime milk on the tray, who watched over this estate like a guardian, was a snake inside the garden. Celine's mind reeled as she pieced it together. The unlocked doors, the staged documents, the subtle nudges that had painted her guilty. A floorboard creaked beneath her shoe. Clarice's head snapped up. Who's there? Celine bolted, heart pounding, bag forgotten. The chase carried her down narrow corridors, Marcus's footsteps thundering behind her. She burst into the wine storage, the air cool and damp, barrels looming like silent sentinels. A faint candle flickered in the distance, just as it had the night she'd first sensed a warning. "End of the line, girl," Marcus growled, his shadow stretching toward her. Clarice closed in from the other side, eyes sharp with the satisfaction of a cornered prey. Panic clawed at Celine, but then her gaze landed on a half-open cabinet shoved behind the racks. Desperation lent her strength. She shoved past Clarice, tore the drawer open, and there it was, a folder thick with documents. Her trembling hands flipped through the pages. Line after line revealed accounts siphoned off into Marcus's name. Transfers authorized with Clarice's credentials. Proof. "Put that down," Clarice hissed, lunging forward. Celine ducked, clutching the folder to her chest, adrenaline burning through her veins. "You framed me," she spat, voice shaking. "You set the fire, you planted the files. This was all you." Marcus snarled, reaching for her arm, but Celine twisted free, scraping her shoulder against the stone wall. The papers nearly spilled, but she gripped them tighter, as if her very life depended on it. Her escape was clumsy, desperate, but fueled by sheer will. She darted through a side passage, hearing Clarice's curses echo after her. Her lungs burned as she climbed the servants' stairwell 2 steps at a time, bursting into the cold night air through a hidden exit. She collapsed behind a row of hedges, chest heaving. The folder pressed so tightly against her ribs it felt like part of her. For a long moment, she could only listen to the rush of blood in her ears, the cries of the protesters beyond the gate, and her own ragged breathing. She had done it. Barely. She was still alive, and now she had the truth in her hands. Yet the weight of the folder was more than paper. It was a choice. If she brought it forward now, she could clear her name and expose Clarice and Marcus. But would Adrian even believe her after everything? Would the board call it fabricated again? And if she hesitated, would she lose the one chance to end this war? Her hands shook as she whispered to herself, "Do I fight now or wait until they destroy themselves?" The folder sat on Celine's lap through the night, its weight heavier than iron. She had read and reread every page until the numbers blurred. Proof. Clear enough to tear Marcus and Clarice apart, to strip their schemes bare. Yet her mind wrestled with the risk. If she walked straight into Adrian's office and dropped it on his desk, he might see nothing but another elaborate trick. He had already accused her once. What would stop him from doing it again? Sleep never came. Instead, Celine sat by the narrow window of her room, staring out the vineyards blanketed in fog. The estate looked ghostly at dawn, as though it were holding its breath. Her own heart felt the same, caught between fear and resolve. She thought of Alara's tear-streaked face at school, the way the little girl clung to her like she was the last branch in a storm. That image carried her through the night. By sunrise, Celine had made her choice. She tucked the folder inside her coat and walked out into the cold morning. The vineyard rows stretched endlessly, wet with dew. Adrian was already there, pacing among the vines as if the earth itself might offer him an answer. His shoulders were rigid, his jaw set in stone. She didn't wait for him to speak. "Adrian," she began, her voice steady though her stomach twisted. "I know you don't trust me. You have every reason not to. But I also know you want Alara safe more than anything. Give me one chance to prove the truth. If I fail, I'll leave this place and never return." Adrian turned, his eyes narrowing. He studied her face as though trying to catch the faintest tremor of deceit. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the rustle of wind through the vines. His expression was unreadable, but there was no mistaking the flicker of hesitation, the first crack in his wall of suspicion. Finally, he spoke, his tone low and worn. "You're asking for more than trust. Celine, you're asking me to gamble what little I have left." "I'm asking you," she said softly, "to gamble on the truth." He exhaled sharply, his gaze drifting toward the distant manor. For once, he didn't dismiss her outright. Instead, he nodded just barely. "One chance. That's all you'll get." Relief coursed through her, though it was laced with the weight of his warning. Together. They walked back toward the house, both of them aware that this fragile truce could shatter at any misstep. Later that morning, seated across a heavy oak table in the study, they pored over the documents. Adrian's fingers lingered on the signatures, the accounts, the transfers. The evidence was damning. Yet Celine knew that simply waving papers in front of the board wouldn't be enough. Marcus and Clarice were too careful, too calculating. They would deny, twist, and deflect. "We need a plan," Celine said. "If we confront them head-on, they'll bury us under doubt. But if we bait them, make them expose themselves." Adrian leaned back, rubbing his chin. "A trap?" "Yes. A meeting with the board. Present a document that looks incriminating but incomplete, something they'll want to seize or silence before it spreads." He gave a dry, bitter laugh. "And when they make their move, we'll be waiting." It wasn't a perfect plan. It carried more risk than certainty. But it was the first moment they had spoken like allies instead of adversaries. For Celine, that was enough to keep moving. The rest of the day passed in tense preparation. Celine drafted a decoy file. Adrian arranged for a private meeting under the guise of damage control. Every step felt like walking a tightrope. She could see the weight pressing on Adrian, the years of pride and legacy bending under the storm. And though he never said it aloud, Celine sensed he was clinging to the hope that, for once, she might not let him down. That evening, when the house had grown quiet, Celine checked on Alara before retreating to her room. The little girl was curled up on her bed, holding a stuffed rabbit that had long lost an ear. When Celine bent to tuck her in, Alara stirred and reached out, wrapping small arms around her neck. "Don't go," the child whispered, her voice muffled against Celine's shoulder. "Everyone keeps saying you're bad, but I know you're not. I trust you." The words pierced Celine deeper than any accusation ever could. She closed her eyes, pulling the girl close. For all the suspicion, for all the fear and danger, here was a trust she could not afford to betray. "I'm not leaving," Celine murmured. "Not now. Not ever." When she stepped out into the hallway, the house seemed less suffocating, the walls less heavy with doubt. Alara's faith had lit something inside her, steady and fierce. Whatever waited at the board meeting, whatever trap they set, she would face it. For Alara's sake, for the truth's sake. The boardroom felt like a courtroom that morning. Heavy blinds muted the sunlight, leaving the long table under a haze of artificial light. Men and women in pressed suits sat rigid in their chairs, whispering to one another, their glances sharp and impatient. At the head of the table stood Adrian, pale but composed, his hand resting on a folder that wasn't what it seemed. "This," Adrian began, his voice echoing through the silent chamber, "is a proposal for financial restructuring, a necessary step, given the rumors surrounding our estate. I invite your full attention." The board leaned forward. Celine, sitting quietly along the wall, clasped her hands together, willing her heartbeat to slow. She knew every line inside that folder had been planted with care, a baited hook dangling in still water. Across the room, Clarice stood near the back, her posture impeccable as always, her eyes cool. She appeared every bit the loyal housekeeper who had attended these meetings countless times, as though she were only there to uphold the family's dignity. But Celine watched closely. The small flick of Clarice's fingers toward her phone, the subtle way she turned her head as if to breathe. Celine recognized it for what it was. A signal. Within minutes, Marcus Hale entered, Damien Cross trailing at his side like a shadow. The two men carried themselves with practiced authority, as though this room already belonged to them. Marcus wasted no time. "Adrian," he said smoothly, "I think the board deserves to see what you've been hiding." He snatched the folder from the table, smirking at the feigned outrage from some members. "This is what you call leadership? A reconstruction plan that is nothing but a veil over corruption." Damien stepped forward, his tone measured. "Gentlemen, ladies, we must face the truth. For the sake of this company, someone else must take the helm." Marcus flipped the folder open, spreading the pages across the table like cards in a rig game. He raised his voice for effect. "Here is the proof of his mismanagement, his manipulation of funds. Clear as day." But the moment his finger jabbed at the page, the screens mounted on the boardroom wall flickered to life. Gasps rippled through the room as lines of code and digital logs appeared. Enlarged on the display were the electronic signatures, traced in jagged fonts, layered over financial transfers. Each line glowed red with an annotation, forged. Then, a second column of data streamed across the screen, login credentials, timestamps, access routes. At the very top, one name stood exposed, Clarice Beaumont. The room erupted. Some board members shouted. Others stood abruptly. Clarice's carefully composed face drained a color. Her lips pressed so tightly they trembled. Impossible. Marcus barked, slamming the folder shut. This is a trick, some digital fabrication. But it was too late. The trap had been sprung. Adrian rose to his full height, and though his voice shook, it carried the weight of years of command. You accused me of deceit. You sought to strip my family of everything. And now, the truth speaks for itself. Marcus' composure snapped. His voice, raw and furious, filled the hall. If it weren't for that girl, he jabbed a finger toward Celine, his rage unmasked. If it weren't for her meddling, all of this would have been finished. The words hung in the air like a confession. The board stared at Celine, then back at Adrian, who turned toward her slowly, as though seeing her clearly. His eyes widened, not with anger this time, but with recognition. The very person he had doubted again and again was standing at the center of his salvation. Clarice tried to slip toward the door, but security guards were already moving. They seized her arms, and she struggled, her one steady voice breaking into frantic pleas. You don't understand. I had no choice. But her words were drowned by the uproar. Marcus cursed under his breath, shoving past chairs, with Damien gripping his arm, urging retreat. Their exit was ugly, hasty, leaving behind a trail of broken pride and hollow threats. Celine sat frozen, her chest heaving. For months, she had been buried under suspicion, treated as a liar, an intruder in a home that was never hers. Now, in the chaos of the boardroom, her role had been laid bare, not a saboteur, but the key that exposed the rot. Her eyes blurred with sudden tears. She pressed a hand against her lips, trying to steady herself, as the board clamored and Adrian finally sat back, exhausted but silent. As Clarice was escorted out, and the meeting dissolved into shouts, Celine let out a shaky breath. The truth had come to light. Yet deep inside, she felt no triumph. The war was not over. Marcus and Damien had not been defeated, only cornered. And cornered men were often the most dangerous. In that dim, chaotic boardroom, Celine understood something with chilling clarity. Exposure was only the beginning. The real battle, the one that would decide the fate of the estate, Adrian, and even Alara, was still waiting beyond those doors. The storm outside the estate had only grown louder. Protesters crowded the iron gates, their voices rolling like thunder over the vineyards. Placards swung above the crowd, accusations painted in bold strokes. Justice for Kilora, exposed the vainer lies. The shouts pressed into the walls, echoing to grand halls where silence otherwise held. Adrian stood at his study window, shoulders bent beneath the weight of it all. He had fought boardrooms, rivals, and betrayals from within his own home, yet the anger of the people fell heavier. Every headline screamed scandal, and every knock on the gate was another demand for surrender. Celine lingered at the doorway, watching him. Part of her wanted to speak, to tell him she believed he hadn't broken. But another part knew words meant little when the world outside was so determined to bury him. Later that evening, Celine sat on the edge of her narrow bed, replaying the recording that had arrived weeks ago, the one that first revealed Marcus and Damien's collusion. Something about it gnawed at her still. She listened closely, rewinding to the end. Damien's voice, almost lost in static, spoke again. The warehouse by the tracks. Tomorrow, we finish this. Her heart leapt into her throat. The same warehouse that had been abandoned for years, a place locals avoided after the roof caved in on one side, a place dark enough to bury secrets. She set the recorder down with trembling hands. She could run to Adrian, beg him to act, but suspicion still shadowed his eyes whenever they met. If she told him now, would he trust her or dismiss her as fabricating yet again? Celine exhaled long and steady. Then it has to be me, She reached for the small recording device she had hidden in her drawer, tucking it into her coat pocket. The thought of walking into that warehouse alone made her stomach twist, but doing nothing was no longer an option. The drive to Kilora's outskirts was quiet, the night pulling its heavy blanket over the fields. With each mile, Celine's mind drifted back to fragments of her own past. The foster homes, the nights lying awake with the sound of other children crying, the gnawing certainty that no one was coming back for her. That ache had shaped her entire life. Now, staring at the dark road ahead, she felt the same threat looming over Alara and Adrian. If I walk away, she whispered to herself, this family will be torn apart just like mine was. The fear that had followed her for years began to twist into something sharper. Not panic, not despair. Resolve. She parked the car in the shadow of a crumbling freight platform, the air heavy with rust and damp. The warehouse loomed 100 feet away, its broken windows reflecting scraps of moonlight. Celine pulled her coat tighter, pressing the recorder in her pocket like a talisman. Every step toward the building was a battle with herself. Her breath clouded in the chill, her pulse racing so loud it drowned the distant hum of the town. The wooden doors creaked under her hand as she eased them open. Inside, the warehouse was a cavern of shadows. Piles of old crates leaned against walls, their labels faded beyond recognition. Somewhere deeper in the darkness, voices rose. We end it tonight, Marcus said, his tone clipped with fury. Don't push me, Marcus. Damien snapped back. You've already let it get out of hand. That stunt at the board meeting. Clarice should have held it together. Celine edged closer, heart hammering. She could see them now through the slats of collapsed wall. Marcus pacing, Damien leaning against a crate, his hands tight fists. Then she froze. Another figure sat slumped in a chair, wrists bound, head lowered but unmistakable. Adrian. Celine's breath caught. Her chest tightened with a violent mix of terror and rage. They had him. Marcus' voice cut through the stillness again. When the police come knocking, we'll feed them what we want. By the time this is over, the estate will be ours, and Adrian will be nothing but a ruined man. Adrian lifted his head just enough for Celine to glimpse the defiance still burning in his eyes. Even gagged, even tied, he hadn't surrendered. Celine gripped the edge of a splintered beam, forcing herself to stay steady. This was the moment everything had been building toward. The choice between stepping back into the shadows or stepping forward, even if it meant risking everything she had left. Her hand brushed against the recorder in her pocket. The device felt impossibly small compared to the enormity of what she faced, but it was all she had. Evidence, truth, courage, wrapped into one fragile plan. She inhaled, trying to drown the fear in her lungs. No more running. Not this time. Drawing one last breath, Celine slipped deeper into the warehouse. The sound of Marcus and Damien's argument growing louder, her eyes locked on Adrian bound in the chair. The warehouse smelled of dust and damp wood, the air thick with the heat of a dozen flickering candles. Adrian sat bound to the chair, his face pale but steady, eyes locked on Marcus. The blade in Marcus's hand caught the trembling light as he pressed it closer to Adrian's throat. Sign the papers, Marcus hissed, his voice sharp enough to cut the silence. Transfer every asset, every share. This ends tonight, one way or another. Adrian didn't flinch, though the knife grazed his skin. His jaw clenched. You'll never own what you could never build. Damien shifted uneasily nearby, arms crossed but posture taut. He tried to sound calm, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Marcus, keep it together. We push too hard. It all unravels. Think. But Marcus wasn't thinking. Rage had swallowed reason whole. His hand tightened on the knife, his breath ragged with desperation. From the shadows, Celine's voice rang out, steady despite the pounding of her heart. It already has unraveled. Marcus spun, his eyes narrowing as Celine stepped into the dim circle of candlelight. She held a small device in her hand, the red light blinking. Every word you've spoken is recorded. The threats, the deal, the betrayal. It's all here. For a heartbeat, the room froze. Adrian's eyes widened, disbelief mixing with a spark of hope. Damien swore under his breath. Marcus snarled, baring his teeth like a cornered animal. You little fool, Marcus spat, charging at her. Celine stumbled back, clutching the recorder to her chest. The knife gleamed as he lunged, and for a moment she thought the world would end there. She caught the edge of a wooden beam, swung sideways, and Marcus's blade struck sparks against the wall instead of her skin. The struggle spilled across the warehouse floor, shadows leaping wildly. Celine's mind raced. She couldn't win against Marcus's brute strength, but she didn't have to. She slipped her phone from her pocket with trembling fingers and pressed a single button. The screen lit, the broadcast began. Far away, in the hushed boardroom of the Vayner estate where the directors sat in tense vigil, Marcus's furious voice erupted from the speakers. His confession spilled into the open, echoing off polished wood and stunned silence. Damien's complicity followed, clear and undeniable. Back in the warehouse, Marcus roared, realizing too late. "What have you done?" "Exposed you," Celine gasped, her arm aching from the struggle. Adrian seized the moment. He kicked out with both legs, slamming his chair against Marcus and sending the knife skittering across the floor. Marcus staggered, cursing, lunging to reclaim it. Celine, desperate, hurled the stack of authentic financial records she had carried with her straight into a pile of dry grape crates. Paper scattered in the air, fluttering like accusing hands. Marcus's eyes darted to them, greed overriding everything. He lunged toward the files, clawing at the evidence that could destroy him. That moment of distraction was all it took. The warehouse doors burst open. Flashlights cut through the gloom, and the heavy boots of security pounded against the floor. "Drop it. Hands where we can see." Marcus whirled, knife in hand, but the sight of rifles leveled against him stopped him cold. He froze, chest heaving, before being slammed against the wall and pinned in iron cuffs. Damien tried to slip into the shadows, but two officers dragged him out, his protest shrill and useless. The sudden silence after the chaos rang louder than the shouting had. Celine collapsed to her knees, her chest burning with exhaustion. The recorder slipped from her fingers, clattering against the floor. Adrian, freed from his bindings, staggered toward her. He knelt beside her, pulling her into his arms as though she had always belonged there. His voice cracked, low but certain. "You saved my daughter," he whispered. Then, tightening his hold, he added, "And you saved this family." Tears she had fought for so long finally broke free, blurring the edges of the candlelight, turning the warehouse into a hazy blur of shadows and brightness. The night outside was still dark, the echoes of anger still rumbling beyond the estate walls. But here, just at this moment, the light had won. The storm that had rattled through the Vayner name finally broke. Marcus and Damien were dragged into the courthouse in chains, their faces pale and drawn, cameras flashing like lightning all around them. Every charge was laid bare: fraud, bribery, conspiracy, and attempted harm. Their empire of manipulation crumbled in full view of the public, and the weight of justice shifted back toward balance. Clarice, the once unshakable guardian of the Vayner household, stood in the witness box with her hands trembling. Her voice cracked as she admitted her role, unlocking doors, planting false papers, feeding Marcus information that only a trusted servant could have known. "I betrayed the family I was meant to protect," she whispered, tears streaking her face. The judge delivered a swift sentence, and though her guilt hung heavy in the air, her confession helped stitch together the narrative that revealed the truth. News stations who had spent weeks tearing the state apart now ran headlines in bold fonts. Vayner State restored. Strength through trial. Reporters spoke of resilience, of a house that endured betrayal yet survived. And though her name wasn't the one in marble above the gates, Celine's face appeared on screen, captured in grainy photos leaving the courthouse or walking hand in hand with Alara. Commentators called her the silent guardian, the woman who stood her ground. But inside the estate, beyond the noise of flashing bulbs and sensational headlines, the real reckoning was quieter. Adrian sat on a veranda of the vineyard one evening, the horizon painted with deep purple dusk. The rows of vines stretched endlessly, their leaves whispering in the breeze. He held a glass of wine untouched in his hand, staring at the land that had nearly been stolen. His voice, when it came, was softer than Celine had ever heard. "I've been a prisoner of my own grief," he said, eyes fixed on the distance. "When my wife died, something in me sealed shut. I convinced myself if I didn't let anyone close, I couldn't lose them. But in doing that, I pushed away the very people who might have helped me heal. Celine listened, her heart tight. He turned toward her then, his gaze unflinching. And then you came. You saved Alara. You saved this home, and all I could do was doubt you. I owe you more than I can ever repay. He paused, his voice dropping. I was wrong. If you're willing, I want you to consider this place your home. Not as a guest, not as someone passing through. As family. The words cut through years of Celine's fear, that relentless whisper she carried since childhood. You don't belong anywhere. The dam inside her broke, and tears streamed freely down her face. She covered her mouth, choking back a sob, then managed a trembling smile. I've been waiting to hear those words my whole life, she said. Thank you. Before either could say more, light footsteps pattered across the veranda. Alara burst through, hair tousled from sleep, clutching her stuffed rabbit. She flung herself into Celine's arms with the fearless affection only a child could carry. Now we can stay together, right? Alara's voice was muffled against Celine's shoulder. She turned her head just enough to look up at both adults, her big eyes shining. We don't have to lose each other anymore. Adrian set his glass aside and wrapped his arms around them both, his large frame pulling Celine and Alara into one embrace. His voice was steady, filled with a certainty that had eluded him for years. No, he said firmly. We're not losing anything. We're holding on. The vineyard fell silent, except for the gentle rustle of the vines and the soft sound of Alara's breathing as she relaxed in their arms. The estate, so long haunted by shadows of mistrust and betrayal, finally felt like a home again. For Celine, the moment was more than a resolution. It was a promise fulfilled. She wasn't just the orphan who drifted through other people's lives, always on the outside looking in. She was part of something lasting, something real. And for Adrian, it was the first time in years that the ache of absence gave way to the warmth of presence. He had lost a wife, yes, but now he had a partner in resilience, and a daughter whose laughter was no longer muffled by fear. As the night deepened, the three of them remained on the veranda, holding close. Beyond the walls, the world still spun with trials, reports, and judgments, but within the vineyard there was peace. A family, unlikely, patched together, but no less true for it, had been forged from fire and loss. The valley was quieter now. The storms of scandal and betrayal at last rolled back like distant thunder. Celine didn't feel like a visitor or an intruder in someone else's story. She was no longer the orphan girl who braced herself for abandonment with every turn. She had weathered enough battles to learn something she never thought possible. She had a home, a family, a place where her presence mattered. Adrian, too, carried himself differently. The hard edges in his voice, once sharpened by grief, had softened. He still bore the weight of years of loss, but he had finally allowed that weight to rest on more than just his own shoulders. Trust had returned to his eyes, a trust he hadn't offered anyone in years. Celine could see in the way he looked at her across the vineyard rows, or in the way he let Alara climb into his lap without hesitation. The fortress of silence around him had cracked, and through it came light. The estate itself mirrored this transformation. Where vines had been torn out and fields left bare during the chaos, new shoots had been planted. Celine walked the rows often, her fingers brushing against tender leaves as if greeting old friends. Adrian had surprised her one morning, standing before the newest section of the vineyard with a sign freshly staked into soil. The lettering read, "The Ward Rose." "It's for you," Adrian had said, a little awkward, as though still unsure how to offer gratitude. "For what you've done, for us, for this land." It needed a name that meant renewal. Her throat tightened, and she couldn't speak for a long moment. She had never thought of herself as someone who deserved a legacy carved into wood and earth. But now, every time she walked those vines, she saw them not just as plants, but as living proof that brokenness could be mended, that life could take root even in soil once scorched. Word spread quickly about the new vineyard, and locals began calling it a symbol of hope. Guests came not just for wine tastings, but to stand among the rows and feel the quiet resilience that seemed woven into the land. And for Celine, it became a place to breathe deeply and believe in the permanence of belonging. Family, she realized, wasn't just blood. It was a choice to stay when things turned dark. It was a courage to open the door when leaving would be easier. The Japanese called it kintsugi, the art of mending broken pottery with gold. Here, the cracks of their lives have been sealed not to hide the pain, but to honor it, to turn wounds into something luminous. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the leaves and the smell of earth hung warm in the air, a young reporter appeared at the gate, notebook in hand, her eyes bright with curiosity. She asked a question that had been circling in many minds since the scandal ended. "What will you do next, Celine?" the reporter asked gently. "After everything you've gone through, what comes now?" Celine looked past her toward the vineyard. The rows stretched out like lines in a story still being written, their green leaves catching the gold of late afternoon. A small smile curved her lips, one that carried both peace and resolve. "I'll stay," she said simply. "For the first time in my life, I've found where I belong, and I'm not walking away." The reporter scribbled down her words, but Celine's attention had already shifted. She felt Alara's small hand slip into hers, warm and sure. Adrian came up on her other side, his steady presence grounding them both. Without speaking, the three of them began walking to the rows together. The sky deepened to a honey glow, the horizon painted with streaks of orange and gold. Their shadows stretched long against the vineyard soil as they moved in step, hand in hand, like a promise made visible. The future still carried questions. There would be challenges ahead, whispers of doubt, and work to rebuild what had been broken. But as the sun lowered and bathed the valley in light, Celine felt none of the old fear. She had walked through fire, and instead of being consumed, she had found a family waiting on the other side. In that moment, with Alara's laughter dancing in the air and Adrian's hand tightening around hers, Celine knew the journey had changed her forever. She was no longer the outsider. She was home, and as the last of the sunlight touched the vines, the ward rose glowed as if the earth itself had been mended with gold. When the smoke clears and the dust finally settles, what truly holds people together isn't blood or fortune. It's the choice to stay, to protect, and to love even when it's difficult. Celine's journey reminds us that family can be found in the most unexpected places, and that broken things, if cared for, can become even stronger. Maybe the question is, in our own lives, who are the people we choose to stand beside? No matter what, if this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next story waiting just around the corner.